Hello and welcome back to the Lib Dem Podcast. And it has been a week beyond anything we can imagine in terms of news. We've had a Labour budget for the first time in nearly a decade and a half. We've had a new Tory leader, and obviously we've just found out that Donald Trump has been re-elected to the US. So to unpick all of that, I have a whole host of new people on the podcast, one of which is actually my boss, but I am still allowed to disagree. We've confirmed this in writing beforehand, but I'm going to go through our whole panel of experts to talk about everything that's happened in this last week or so. So my name is John Potter. I'm the leader of the Preston Lib Dems. And next to me is Councillor Jake Austin, who is one of our Stockport councillors. Welcome to the podcast, Jake.
Hi, John. Very happy to be here.
Wonderful. We have former Councillor John Bridges. I think you've been a councillor twice, but also a stalwart of the party and lead singer at Glee. Hi, John. Welcome.
Hi. I'm not sure that's my greatest qualification. But certainly
What is your greatest qualification?
Well,
no, we can't say. It's a family show. We better not say that. And we have the Deputy Chief Exec of the ALDC, Ed Stephenson. Hello, Ed. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
So, loads to get on with. Jake, let's start with yourself. Okay, and we have to start with the US election result. What are your impressions of it?
A week full of Dramala for Kamala.
Yeah.
For sure. I would almost like to be surprised. I guess I kind of was surprised when the result came through, because the polls were saying it was pretty much going to be a 50-50 split in terms of what was going to happen in the US election. The results that came in didn't really indicate a 50-50 split. Donald Trump's won the popular vote, which nobody expected, and all of the 7 swing states that were going to be up for grabs for either of the candidates. It's kind of tough to take in a little bit, especially as Liberals in the UK. I think a lot of Liberals are probably feeling a bit of a deep sense of dread and disappointment. But I'm forever the optimist, so I'm convinced that things will probably be okay for the next 4 years.
What about you, John? Optimistic, or was it? Because I mean, not only did Trump win, he won. I think he went forward in every state except 2, which were Utah and Washington. So it was pretty comprehensive win. But what's your impressions?
Well, on a personal level, depressed, and I'm sure a lot of other Liberals out there are depressed as well. But we have sort of been here before, and I actually remember staying up listening to Radio 4 when Reagan got elected. And I similarly thought how unlikely is that we could elect somebody like Ronald Reagan as President of the United States, and what implications that would have for the world. But it wasn't the end of the world, and life goes on, and we'll sort it out somehow. But I do feel for a lot of my friends in the States who are feeling quite distraught at the moment.
Yeah, and obviously I realise we're an all-white male panel, but I think, Ed, one of the things that's come out of this was actually the gender vote was very divided in America. Maybe not as much as what people thought, but I assume a lot of people who are most worried have been those of minorities and women about what this will mean going forward.
Yeah, so I think Donald Trump moved forward across all demographics, including gender, and he moved forward with both women and men. And I think there was a big expectation from the Democratic Party in their campaign that they would be able to get enough of the female vote out to make it much closer than it actually turned out to be. So that will be, I think, a source of significant disappointment for them. And again, so I repeat your point, say we're an all-male panel, but there is that question around how do the Democrats or the Republican Party successfully get a female candidate to be president of the US.
Yeah.
And
do you think that was an actual factor? Does the rest of the group think that is America just not ready to elect a female politician? Sorry, I'll let you finish your point first.
I mean, just on that, I would say that I'm not going to be able to speak about being a woman, but what I can speak about a little bit is the challenge of campaigning for female candidates, which is something I've done for lots of people. And it is different. Mm-hmm. It is different. And the expectations people have, the ideas they already have in their head about what kind of person would do that, what kind of person would be an MP in the experience that I have, or a councillor, is very, very different. And I think it is much more challenging. And I am aware that there are some electoral studies that show that actually being a woman on a ballot paper is a benefit. That does not bear out my experience at all. And I think there are some really ingrained social issues. Having said that, I'm not convinced that that is the reason the election was lost. So, you know, it's not everything, but there is a lot of work to do.
And I suppose, Jake, I'll let you come in on that point. I think everyone's trying to justify from their own point why this might not have happened, because some people have talked about the issue with the Middle East, you know, with regards to the Jewish vote in Pennsylvania versus the Arab vote in places like Michigan. But actually, if you look at, again, all these things are usually way too simple. And if you actually look at the exit poll, it said only 5% of people going to the polls thought that foreign affairs was anywhere near the top of their agenda. It came back to cost of living and how people felt in the economy.
100%. I think we could dissect every little detail of why Kamala didn't win. And I do think gender played a part in that. But as you just mentioned, there are people who are talking about third-party voters, voting for people like Jill Stein because they're not happy with the stance on Gaza that the Democrats have taken. People are talking about all different types of little demographics, and if more women had come out for Kamala, for example, then she would have won. I think ultimately it comes down to, as a macro picture, people want to change, and despite Donald Trump having already been a president before, and people know what that's like, unfortunately, Kamala was the incumbent. She had all of the disadvantages of being an incumbent, but none of the advantages of people actually knowing who she is because she hadn't been the president. So unfortunately, she was seen as the scapegoat, and the Republicans, I think, played an absolute blinder by making one of the big issues in terms of immigration something that she was allegedly responsible for the entirety of her term as vice president. And that means that people just wanted to vote her out because they wanted to vote for change and they wanted something different. And I think that's a bit of a global trend. We're seeing it with elections in Europe, we're seeing it with elections pretty much everywhere at the moment. Japan had a recent election where they voted against their government. South Africa, for the first time this year, came very close to getting rid of the ANC out of government. And it's because I think incumbency is difficult in a global environment where people are feeling the stress of cost of living, the stress of inflation, and they're blaming incumbents and they're blaming globalisation for that. And populists like Donald Trump can take advantage of that in a much better way than Democrats like Kamala Harris can.
I suppose the question is, were the Democrats always likely to lose, John, in this? Because I can say I said it publicly on the podcast. I always thought Trump would win. I mean, it's a bit like what we say at ALDC is that select your candidates early. With Kamala Harris having just over 100 days, whereas Trump having 4 years, do you think that basically made it didn't matter what they did?
I'm not sure about the 4 years and the number of days, but she didn't distance herself from Biden sufficiently.
Yeah. Okay.
She didn't make herself look like a change candidate. And I think that was a problem. And I think, as has been mentioned, in a situation where a lot of people have grown up with a basic feeling that things are going to get a bit better. It might only be marginally, but over time. The cumulative impact of a number of things, including COVID, means that hasn't been the case, and they tend to blame or at least look for an alternative elsewhere from the people who've been in charge in the period when their life hasn't been getting better.
Yeah, I suppose then, Ed, it comes to a point, okay, what does this mean for all of us? Obviously, we've had a direct thing, what does it mean for the Americans, and but obviously everyone's thinking about Ukraine, Taiwan, the rest of Eastern Europe. What does it mean for trade? America trade with Britain is the second biggest bloc after the EU?
Mm-hmm. So I think I'll come to that question, but just before I do, I just want to say I think that there is a couple of important lessons here, though. I think that Kamala Harris and her campaign team did a really, really, really good job.
Yeah, I agree.
And they will be knackered and they will be bruised, and it is hard losing.
Yeah.
So we need to respect that. And I think with 100 days, there is only so much you can do. Mm-hmm. The other important thing that we need to just note here is that Donald Trump won that election, and he won it for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons that he won it is because he is an excellent political communicator. Yeah. He embodies his message. It is clear. It is in everything he does, and he's been running for 10 years.
Yeah.
So just on what I think it means, I think the biggest single losers are not the Americans, are not us. It's Ukraine, it's the Baltic states. Yeah. That's what scares me. It's what should terrify people across Europe. I think we can focus on trade, but at the end of the day, life and death is actually life and death. And And I would be very, very, very worried if I was waking up in Estonia this morning, or in Kyiv,
or Georgia,
or any of those. I mean, if Donald Trump, and let's be clear, he has no excuse for not delivering now. He has every level of government and the judiciary.
And no adults in the room in terms of, he was surrounded, in his first term, he was surrounded by civil servants that had been in the job for decades, those guardrails that were there. He is surrounded himself by family and sycophants.
Indeed. And I think you've got to look at the message that it sends. If his solution for stopping the conflict in Ukraine is to hand it, or a large part of it, to Putin, and the message that sends for potential conflicts around the world, and how that will be seen in Beijing. So I think it's very, very worrying on that level. I think, like many things in politics, if you're doing okay in your own life, probably in Britain or in America, this will be fine. You won't affect you that much. So there will be a minimal effect on lots of people, and people who are lucky like us. But as always, it's the most vulnerable people that suffer when someone like this gets into power.
And okay, John, you share that? Is it just your consequences of this?
I think that's very true. I think it will motivate some people to get involved in politics. Okay. Certainly Thatcher winning in 79 got me involved. I was so shocked that she won, that it got me involved. There may be some weird pluses in the future, because I was horrified at Reagan getting elected, but actually he was partly involved in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. Who would have expected that, when he first got elected? So we always look at the bad consequences, because we've been focusing on that for the last few months. But you never know. We might be lucky, and there may be some positives out of it all in the end. But it does look very bleak at the minute. And
it's a weird thing, because I was thinking on the way into work this morning, it's about there's an attraction to chaos sometimes, because we're so used to an order of things, and particularly to voters saying, actually, someone who's just going to throw the chips in the air and see where they land is very attractive to voters, particularly if you've had a decade or half a decade of stagnant growth. Your life doesn't seem to have got any better, so it's kind of like, sod it, let's just see what happens with the dice. And I completely get that strategy. And Jake, I suppose one of the things, the consequences that might happen is also what this means for Britain going forward in terms of our political landscape, because we're going to talk about Kemi Badenoch being elected into the Tory party. Are the Conservatives and Reform going to think, well, you know what, maybe this culture war shit does work?
I think we can, in the immediate future, be relatively relieved that we're about 4.5 years away from any election happening in the UK.
But I assume Labour are thinking, we were elected on a very wide coalition, as Joe Biden was, and how easily that has disintegrated in the States. Labour must be thinking, right, we might be in trouble here.
Yes, I think the problem the reason that Labour won so heavily with the general election, though, wasn't necessarily because it had a wide coalition, although they did. It was more because voters for the Tories didn't really turn out in the numbers that they would have done in previous elections, in the same way that Democrats had a big turnout down from 2020 over to 2024.
Do we agree with that? I don't know. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure I agree with that, really. I think that the main thing was the change in the base of the Labour vote and how much more efficient it was. So losing votes in central Manchester in order to gain votes in Macclesfield was very much their strategy. And I think there's a huge difference there, because I think what Labour didn't really even attempt to do in the run-up to 2024 was play to their base whatsoever.
And it only cost them a couple of seats, like Bristol, Blackburn, places like that.
Worthy sacrifices for the big majority. No, I do take that point. I think I'm just less worried about the context of the US election in terms of British politics particularly, because in Britain we've had these populist parties that have tried to do the Donald Trump rhetoric. Nigel Farage is I don't like the guy, but he's a relatively gifted politician, and you could argue largely responsible for what happened with Brexit. and he's been trying to get elected and has successfully finally got elected as an MP on his, what was it, 9th attempt or something along those lines?
Maybe 8th, but it was a fair few, yeah.
Yeah, and you can see the trend of reform doing better in elections, and that populism sort of speaking to a subsection of the UK population. But we've had this sort of politics in the UK for a really long time, and it's never managed to take hold in the same way. Maybe, presumably, because there just isn't somebody like Donald Trump in the UK who's able to speak to people in the same way he is in the US.
I don't think it's just about the candidate, though. I also think it's about the hollowing out of high-quality people in the Conservative Party and the lack of high-quality people ever having been.
Are you talking about membership, or are you talking about membership of the politicians, or both?
I'm talking about both. So I think, to be a successful political party, you need to do some of those things that Donald Trump's done very well, that the Democrats do very well. So, ground game and stuff like that is not everything, but it is part of it. But what is a lot of it is message and having a clear message. And I just don't think, and I might be wrong, that Nigel Farage, as gifted as he is capable of bridging as wide a gap as somebody like Donald Trump. And their message is not correct, and nor do they have currently. I know there's some rumours about them doing some sensible things and they're delivering in some local government by-elections. We know how difficult translating local government by-election success is to winning parliamentary seats.
I actually think the local government by-elections, because we've had now over 100 since the general election, actually backs up that point. If you look at where Reform are, yes, their vote is up, but they've actually only gained 2 seats since the general election. They are getting, north of 20%. But they're not getting the high 30-40% to win in all but 2 seats. So it is whether or not they can convert kind of being a protest party into something that actually...
So the way they win is by stopping talking about some of the awful stuff that they talk about. Yeah. It is not through culture war stuff.
Yeah, I think that's over hopeful.
You reckon? No, explain.
Don't be too depressing. I was... Just last evening, I was overhearing a conversation between a group of guys of different ages, different backgrounds, it was a long discussion about quite a lot of political issues, and they were saying an awful lot of things I didn't agree with in it. But I'm going to pick one out, which was somebody said, and you wouldn't, a few years ago, you just wouldn't have expected anybody to say this. Yeah. And he was saying with confidence that they've already discovered a cure for cancer and they're just keeping it from us. And it's all a big conspiracy. Yeah. And I just thought, these are pretty ordinary, straightforward UK citizens, yet they believe this. And it's it's obviously come through the internet, blah, blah, blah. But these ideas are out there, and they are, unless they're challenged, unless we do something, they're going to increasingly... hold ground, and these people are going to be open to very, very Trumpist type.
But do you think these views always existed, but now people feel almost happy to say them? Is that the fact that these people that believe the Earth was flat
people
and the
have
New Zealand
found their community, because if you're a flat earther, before you would go around
on your own,
telling people that they'd look at you very weird. Now you can find a Facebook group to talk about your flat earthiness with other people.
And there's now a legitimate political platform for a lot of those sort of beliefs in the way that there hasn't really been in the past. Yeah. And one that is bizarrely becoming more and more socially acceptable in a way that, say, the National Front wouldn't have been in the 70s and 80s.
But I still don't think that they're and I hope I'm right. I might be wrong. It's not like me to be optimistic.
He's not lying.
He's not lying.
But I don't think you can win with that alone. So that kind of stuff is not enough. And we might not like the record of delivery of Donald Trump of the Republican Party. Certainly I don't. But there is one. Okay? And reform, what happened to UKIP? UKIP won a load of councillors. Those councillors were rubbish. Yeah. And when their message and their national party went away, those councillors all lost their seat. And now that never happens. So all of the ratepayers, which is a party that basically stopped existing many, many decades ago, have pretty much lost their... have still hold on to some of their seats. The Continuity Liberal Party still have seats. it is a remarkable fall from grace. And when you win on something that narrow, and then you don't deliver anything because you've not even thought about it, there is a problem. And that's the difference. The Republican Party has a long record of delivering something for the American people, and something that they will claim, so many things that they will claim are good and valuable things.
So what would we say? Okay, because there will be Liberals waking up and saying, obviously, very downcast, scared for everything that means, but also that we would, how do we stop it from coming over here? Because I know in my county seat next year, I know there's a Reform candidate going to be standing against me. He's already throwing his weight around, for lack of a better expression, in terms of saying this stuff, making sure every post by Nigel Farage is sent around all the local community groups and things like that. So Jay, what would be your advice to someone like me who has to take on maybe some of this populist nonsense next year?
I think in the immediate term of feeling pretty crap because of the US election, which is pretty standard for everyone, or any liberal-minded people, my advice is democracy kind of is a constant thing. It's not something that just stops when we have a big setback or when someone like Donald Trump wins. And it feels like a big setback, and it feels like really crap. Like, I have friends that were crying at the news of Donald Trump winning because of what it represents for, say, minorities and the potential that could cause in the Western world, and the ripple effect that America could have on that. But democracy keeps going on. To maybe use a paraphrase Kamala, we need to keep fighting to keep winning at the end of the day. So people need to get involved and do more if they feel that anger and they're not already involved, which if you listen to this podcast, you probably are.
Yes, we are very niche of a niche. I suppose, John, you were a campaigns officer for LDC for a long time. What would you say to someone having to deal with exactly those sorts of views that you heard on your trip home?
I think just delivering, because I also think a lot of people in with that sort of mindset, if you are visibly delivering what you said you would deliver, that will impress them. That still will impress them if you can demonstrate. But you have to not only do it, you have to communicate that you're doing it. And that's a classic error of an awful lot of incumbents, is that they don't, whatever they're doing in the background, which might be great for their local community, they don't actually get out there and say it to enough people. And
at a conference, I remember I was doing a training session, and it was all about winning the counties next year, and it was about lots of Lib Dems, councillors and campaigners do brilliant stuff, but they are not great at telling people how brilliant they are.
They sort of assume people will know through osmosis, but it doesn't work like that, sadly.
And I suppose, Ed, final word on this is, again, what... In terms of the local elections, next 2 years, we've got particularly big English county elections next year. I suppose that will be a slightly different fight to what the MPs have to face in 4.5 years' time, because they will have to deal with a lot of this national kind of stuff, whereas actually maybe our local candidates can win by being that community champion. Yeah. I suppose that's a different kind of battle next year to 2029.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, a couple of points. I agree with everything that Jake and John say. John, in particular, the pragmatism is so important. Get out and show you're delivering. Put it on a piece of paper and stick it through a letterbox. And get out and door knock and be part and integral with your campaign. The difference between local elections and these really high turnout elections like the US general election or the general election here is predominantly around turnout. And that means that the audience you're going to be speaking to is slightly more engaged with the community, more likely to vote, more positive about politics, actually. And so that lower turnout gives us loads of opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to run simple things like run a better polling day, get people onto postal votes. And these things really matter in a lower turnout election. So get out there. And the other thing I would say is, and this might be unpopular, but populism is not always bad.
I completely agree.
Okay, so in order to make any difference, to make any change at all in this world, we have to win. And when you're fighting against people who are prepared to say anything, who are prepared to be wicked, you need to be unreasonable with yourself, and you need to make sure that you are really pushing yourself to the limit. So when it gets to polling day, when it gets to the day after polling day, you're happy regardless of the result, that you left everything on the table. And that's just something that we need to obviously look after ourselves while we're doing it. But, this stuff matters. We make a difference in our communities through our action. We cannot give the reins of power to people like Donald Trump or whoever their local council candidate equivalent is, and there are many of them.
So you've just tweaked my interest here, because I was just thinking that we say populism isn't always bad. I think, is that because we get confused between populism and extremism, which often go hand in hand, but actually it doesn't have to be the case?
I think populism as a whole, just generally as a vibe, is it's you versus the world sort of thing. Like, I'll protect you from the big corporations, the big government which is out of touch, and I'm for you, I am with you. That sort of populism. It's effective and it speaks to people, because often, whether it's true or not, people do feel that institutions, politicians, other companies, the world around them is out of touch with what they believe and what they think. And populists like Donald Trump leverage that in a way really effectively to get people to support them, because they feel like Donald Trump is,
even though he's a billionaire with a golden suitcase.
But that's just the power. It's the power of populism, isn't it?
That's
it's
right.
Like, you can take somebody who is so far removed from what the average American voter is going to be like, and make them feel that they are on the same level as you, and that they are looking out for you, and that's what populism does.
And I suppose, and we've had that other version was Boris Johnson. I mean, Boris Johnson, an Etonian guy who has never done probably a day's graft in his life, but because people related to him, and he saw it loads in the focus group saying he's the kind of guy I'd want to go to the pub with.
Yeah.
You wouldn't trust him with your daughter or your sister, but actually you would actually. He said he's genuine, even if he's comes across as a buffoon. He's like.
You're absolutely right. These people come across with integrity, and they come across as they have a character. And so people are willing to forgive flaws, but it's also messaging. It's also focus on the end user. So what did we hear when we were watching Republicans talk? We heard gas prices. So we'll forgive the fact that they don't know the word petrol, but gas prices. and we heard
food prices.
And we heard groceries, right?
Yeah.
And then the rebuttal, the conversation on some of those shows, if you're watching the election results, well, okay, so the US economy, we know because we're really engaged, best in the G7, fantastic. Inflation down faster than in other places, okay? And if you've got a really decent stock portfolio, then your S&P 500 is going gangbusters. You're doing brilliantly, right? Well, that's not how people feel. Focus on the end user. If you go to the shop and you feel poorer after having left it than you did a year ago, you're unhappy. Everybody is.
And you've segued us perfectly into our next section, which is, of course, the Labour budget that came out. And it seems almost mind-blowing that it was less than 2 weeks ago that was actually... And it was such a massive moment in policy. And Ed, we'll start with you on this one, because obviously the headlines that most people know now, it was lots of spending, lots of extra kind of borrowing to finance that as well, and also and new tax burdens, shall we say, particularly on business, but obviously it will go on to all of us eventually. And you were talking about populism. Now, given what's happened to Labour in the first 100 years, it's felt that way at times. You're right. Yeah. Given what's happened to Labour these first 100 days, clearly they're not going for the populist approach here.
Yes.
Although there was some bits of it, things like you would say about the fuel duty again. 14 years now, the fuel duty hasn't risen. Taking a penny off beer, all these things. But generally, what was your impression of that Labour budget? Was it brave for doing the stuff that maybe wasn't unthinkable, or was it daft, or somewhere in between?
I'm going to concentrate on my feelings rather than the policy. My feeling was that it was kind of boring, that it was in many ways like being the biggest tax raising budget I think of all time, certainly since the 50s. Should have been radical, and yet there wasn't. We raised all of this money and then we spent it on massive question marks. So I was happy to see there was some investment in the NHS. And I think that should have been their number one priority. But I just can't help but feeling, like you say, it was sort of an anti-populism. It was a big pile of poo sprinkled with a penny off of a pint in a pub.
Buy 99 pints, get one free.
Which will of course go back on tenfold after they have to pay extra money from the national insurance.
Sure, but do we think... So, I mean, I'm being devil's advocate here because it's not my job to defend the Labour government, but obviously things like the infected blood scandal, the Horizon scandal, they are doing the things that we know the Tories were shamefully just not doing because they thought we don't have to do it before the general election. But John, you've been around and seen plenty of budgets in your time, but that sounds unusually harsh. But John,
not wrong though.
No, but you've been also fighting Labour here in Manchester for a long time. What's your impression of their first budget?
I just think, and anybody who's a Labour supporter here will probably hate me for saying this, but it's a bit like Ramsay MacDonald in that. They're trying to do...
You might have to explain that to some of us.
Well, no. Formed a national government. The Labour Party hated him forever because he thought it was in the national interest and it was the right thing to do. And it was it was the right thing to do, even if it wasn't in the party interest.
Yeah.
And I think there's an element of that in some of what Labour's been doing. Not everything. They've obviously tried to have sweeteners thrown in there. But they think that they've got to have all the tough stuff right at the beginning because it takes time to work through. But I think they've overdone it, frankly.
Yeah,
from not only from their own perspective, which I do think politically they've overdone it, but I also think economically they could put us into recession because an awful lot of the investment, and we haven't seen the nitty-gritty of that, as you said, the investment element of it, the putting money back into the economy, a lot of it is presumably based on infrastructure investment, and we're not going to see that hit for several months, if not years, because it takes time for these things to happen. And we probably are going to get another financial statement which is going to go through some more of the detail, I expect, despite the leak on HS2 and the things of that sort. But particularly when you throw money at the NHS, it's a really good example, really. Demand for the NHS is increasing because of our ageing population, all sorts of reasons why demand for it can suck in money with no visible result that an ordinary elector would see.
Because Wes Streeton was very clear before the election, it would be money with reform. Now, we don't know what that reform will be. And Jake, we did an episode, the podcast did an episode before about, we called it miserableism within Labour. And what John was saying, whether they overdid it. Maybe in perfect good intention, because they were saying, right, we're going to do something, we're going to splurge this sort of money. We need to let the markets know that we're not Liz Truss. And actually, we're going to take tough decisions. It's not just going to be unicorns. But one of the things that obviously came out was the winter fuel payments. Yeah. Now, a way they could have done that, I suppose, because if they had announced that as part of the budget, they wouldn't have had months of bad headlines. But actually, what they wanted to do is give people enough time to plan for this winter. Where you're thinking, if they were probably being more politically savvy, they'd have announced it at the budget and have it start next winter. But I can't quite know. Is it the fact, I think it was Tom Morrison said on a previous episode, that there's not enough politics in their brain maybe to get this stuff right?
I think that's probably 100% it. There's John kind of alluded to it earlier in terms of, and you just mentioned it, in terms of the miserableism and the sense of everything sucks and there is no hope or optimism in our politics whatsoever, which is kind of what Labour's been plagued with for the last 100 days plus of their administration. And I think the budget was almost an attempt to try and shake that off. You got it from the press releases that they was talking about investments and them trying to do something more about it. But I think that they've gone in so heavy and hard with winter fuel payment cuts, £40 billion of black hole. It's going to be so hard to fix all of this mess. Everything sucks, everything's rubbish, and it's going to continue to be for a while, that it's kind of hard to take away any impression from the budget other than that sort of thing continuing.
But it's not just the politics of this. This is also about the economics. If people don't feel that things are getting better, they won't spend money, and that has a knock-on effect to the economy. Yeah. If they don't spend money, that puts people out of work.
And Ed alluded to it when we were talking about the American instance, and I can't remember who it was. I think it might have even been Nick Clegg, where, poverty plus £5, you don't feel rich. That's the whole thing of it. And whereas, I think it was Stalin they were talking about previously, where they'd said, actually, oh no, it was tell you the truth, it was Rishi Sunak, when they were saying, actually, these people are really struggling with the cost of living. Well, don't you know this government has allowed X, Y and Z to happen? And it's like, no one cares if they can't afford to buy pasta as much as they used to. That is the very real, tangible thing that they struggle with.
Pasta is delicious.
Pasta is excellent. We can agree on that. I think this is a unite front. But other things that came up that I want to talk about. So we have to talk. Well, the bus charges one was an interesting one, which again was one that didn't raise masses of money. And I think the politics behind Labour doing it, because basically for those that don't know, there was a cap set by the Tories during COVID, I believe, or maybe just after COVID, of a £2 cap on bus fares. It was due to come to an end. It had a sunset clause, so it was going to fail. But then Labour decided to extend it, but raise it to £3, which obviously a 50% raise will make up over £400 a year to an average bus user. So, but for that, again, and they seem to want us to be grateful for them for extending it for a year instead of understand the politics of that is pretty horrendous, Ed.
Yeah, I think broadly there are two solutions here. One is that they're trying to set this narrative train over Parliament, where it's really, really bad, gets a bit better, and then it's really good. The other option, which is probably the most likely option, is that they're just not very good at politics. Yeah. And I think this is one where I would say the messaging here is so confused. Yeah. So we went from a government to be before the election saying that the economy and growth was their biggest thing, and that the other thing that probably people have any recollection of talking about at all was Great British Energy, which is a good idea, all about the environment. So in what world is that your message before the election? And then you come out with a budget that not only doesn't prompt economic growth, it probably stifles it. Yeah. At least that's what the experts seem to think, and I am not an economist. But also where you make a load of tough decisions, but you freeze fuel duty and add 50% to the price of a bus ticket, and 6.7% to rail fares as well. I mean, so I think that. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have no problem with freezing fuel duty, but it's so confused. It's crazy. What would a person think that is just looking at this? What do Labour stand for? What do Labour believe in? And I think one of the overwhelming feelings that I get from it is no change.
Yeah, but wasn't that the point of Sue Gray got fired? Keir Starmer's chief of staff got fired or let go or shuffled out, whatever you want to call it. And Morgan McSweeney was brought in exactly for that reason, to add clarity and almost like a Dominic Cummings sort of character. This is going to be our foe, and it hasn't improved it. And I don't quite get.
Well, maybe it would have been worse.
Yeah, potentially. Yes, we don't know. And maybe some of the splurges did come from Morgan McSweeney saying to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, actually we need to give someone some hope that actually better things are coming. Because otherwise, Labour are not going to have a successful election in 4.5 years' time.
Yeah. So we've just talked a little bit earlier about how Labour were actually really quite good at building a broad coalition for the general election. Yeah. And I do feel like they obviously do have political sense, because they just won a majority of 170 or something.
How much was that? So, I mean, I might take a little bit of a different view on that, because I think how many people voted actively think Labour are brilliant, I'm voting for them, compared to how many people just really hated the Tories?
I think it was very much a Ming-Bar strategy of not wanting to just walk along, make sure nothing bad happens to the Labour Party, don't promise anything, not promise anything, basically just let the Tories collapse. Yeah. But that was a really good political decision, and it worked really well. They've had the biggest majority that they've had since 2005.
Yeah, maybe.
And so they clearly are politically adept, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about a government with such a huge majority.
Opposition's easy.
But it's different, isn't it? Yeah. It is different running in a general election and being in opposition and going against what the status quo is, especially when the status quo is such a massive pile of poo. Yeah. And then being in government and suddenly having to be competent at governing and doing budgets and fixing the mess that was there before them as well. Yeah. It's a very, very different political having to have a very different political brain, and I'm just not convinced that they are easing too well into that.
It felt very much to me like a budget which was decided on by committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we know how well that works with writing leaflets. I mean, not at all well. And it ended up not being an economist budget, which one might have expected from how Rachel Reeves had been sold. And it ended not being a political budget in the kind of style that George Osborne might have done quite successfully in the past. And I think you've ended up with this little bits of political stuff that really annoy the economists and the talking heads in studios and think that's really rubbish, and a load of non-political stuff that really annoys the general public. And between you, what you've managed to do is annoy both the normal working man on the street and the commentariat. And so you've got a problem where really I can't think that anybody's happy after this budget. I can't think of a group of people who would go, great.
And what was really interesting, and we'll move on to some of the other things that are being controversial from a Lib Dem point of view, is the people before the budget who were worried what was going to be in it. Again, part of this miserableism is that I remember listening to focus groups where people were just saying, for the first time I'm actually worried what this might mean. So that had already set in even before, and is a really, and going back to what we were talking about local elections, one thing that we have seen across the entire country, and basically every area of the country, is Labour losing masses of votes. Now part of that is when you win, your supporters get a little bit more, they get not deflated in terms of sad, but in terms of they're not so anxious for change, but Labour are losing across the board to everyone.
And there's usually a honeymoon period, isn't there?
Yeah, and that has not existed. So Labour have had their worst performance since the general election since '93, and that includes Lib Dems in coalition. So they have got some rebuilding to do. But let's talk about, firstly, we should mention about local government finances, because a lot of our listeners will be councillors, of which there was basically nothing, and what that means. And actually we got what that means the day before the budget, is that local government reorganisation is coming, and two-tier authorities will probably be scrapped, and we'll probably do a lot more on that on another episode, because it looks like my area of Lancashire was down as one of the first to potentially go along with Essex, so we will see what that means. Obviously some of you are already in unitary authorities like you, Jake, so you don't have to worry, but actually you do have to worry, because all councils, if there's no increase to their core funding or ways that councils can raise money more, and it might be that they just release the cap on what council tax increases, they can push that problem into councils.
And any extra support that does come is likely just going to get eaten up by the increase in national insurance and the increase in the national minimum wage and living wage.
Has it been confirmed that national insurance increase for councils will not be covered by government? Has that been confirmed?
I think it's been confirmed that it would be covered, but it's coming out of...
But also it's not just that, it's independent contractors. I mean, it is a huge deal here. So we need to forget that councils are not just public sector workers. Increasingly over the years, they're outsourcing large things, the bins, a lot of social care services, and these things will have a huge knock-on cost to councils.
Road repairs as well, lots of councils don't do them in-house as well.
I think it's very interesting. I have a couple of friends in the civil service who said Labour were running around trying to get this stuff working, and it really looks to me like this is a bit of a mess, because I don't know if there's a lack of understanding. I doubt there is. There are a lot of Labour MPs who were councillors about where council finances are, that councils across the country are on the edge, and that this is a crisis, and yet they've put no money in realistically. I've heard some Labour sources say they're putting 3% in. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not in the budget. So
no, it's not in the budget.
And
it's not a protected department.
It's not a protected department, and some of the money that they're talking about is like £500 million for social care, to fix social care. So yes, of course we need money to fix social care. The reality of the situation is £500 million would do a really good job of fixing social care in one unitary council. It's not enough money. It's loopy.
Well, I mean, they've spent. I mean, it's not. To be fair, it's not just the Tories. Government has spent many years transferring responsibilities onto local government. So that if your housing is rubbish or whatever it might be, or social services or children's services, it's somebody else's fault. And the number of responsibilities councils have had, statutory responsibilities that they can't dodge, means that all the discretionary stuff goes out the window, and they're stuck with these horrendous problems, particularly in areas where demographics are playing a part, of how they make their accounts balance. And if they're not providing from the national government level the logical thing to do. And if you were extrapolating the other things, sort of some of the other stuff they've been doing, getting the unpopular stuff out there first, the logic is to reform the financing of local government in some radical way. And there are options.
Because Labour are not...
But all of them are wildly unpopular.
Yeah, because Labour government is not going to sit back and allow dozens or maybe hundreds of Labour-run councils go pop. They will have to do something about it, because ultimately it will get back to the... And I don't understand, what governments always do is put that, so when the Tories did this a lot, they had what was like the social care precept, where they said, oh, we're putting X amount of billions into social care. No, you're not, you're allowing councils to raise council tax to pay for that. So it's still coming from the residents, you're not doing it via the bigger instrument of government funding. So I'm really nervous, because because I'm on two authorities, that both of them are not too far away from going pop.
No,
really.
We've got a situation where the government is handing off someone else to do the dirty work.
Yeah.
They are abdicating their responsibility for this country. We've got a situation where councils are spending up to 90% of their budgets, principal authorities, on social care, and just social care, which is a statutory responsibility that they can't budget for. And by the way, they can't run a deficit budget either. Yeah. And frankly, it's appalling.
And the scary thing about that, because again, Lancashire is a top tier authority dealing with social care, is actually, you might think this is all, people talk about billions and millions and all these departments, but actually what it means is those councils are looking for ways to save costs, which directly affects the residents on our street, whether that's the amount of care visits they get, the time they get the care visits, these awful mistakes you hear about in press about people being left utterly alone, freezing cold, no support, getting much more ill, potentially much worse than that. That is the very real consequences of these things. And we can sometimes talk about the wider, geopolitics of it, but actually, if you go right down, it's those people that will really suffer, having gone through everything else they're going through with price rises. So it is very serious, and you like to say it is the next scandal probably coming, is what will happen with council finances, because the government absolutely thinks they can just get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, when people look at all of the government departments and think about the spending, I understand why health is top of the list. I understand why education's high up the list. There are lots of valuable... I even understand why defence is something we need to be spending more on right now. But I don't think people understand what is under the hood of HCLG, of Housing, Communities and Local Government as a department. That, at the end of the day, is the department, through councils, working with councils, that is delivering the vast majority of services that most people use most of their time, whether it's streetlights, bins, roads. This stuff matters. Parks. These are the things that make our areas special, that make our communities great and lovely and nice to live in. The things that really most people care about most of the time. And it just simply isn't good enough, and somebody needs to shout about it. It just simply isn't good enough. We have to fix this before it becomes an absolute crisis, and as you say, a scandal. Yeah,
and I suppose if you're Lib Dem in control, you need to be shouting about it because you don't want to be blamed for those terrible decisions. And if you're a Lib Dem not in control, then you are absolutely shouting because you need to make this fuss so we can change it going forward. Because like on most things in politics, if politicians will get away with them until they feel political pressure. And that's the point. If we're a part of a political party, to put that pressure onto it. I'm going to talk very briefly, because I know we've gone on longer than I thought we would have. Is one thing that has come in regarding it's been about farming and the inheritance on farming. Now, Lib Dems have had, and we've had two different views on this. Some talking about it's about rich people getting away with it, but there's also a political, as in using farms and inheritance as a way of avoiding it, but also big complaints from people like Tim Farron and a lot of our now rural MPs, of which we have lots, saying actually those family farms, there is virtually no way they can continue. Now, Jake, Stockport doesn't have vast amount of farms, I don't think, in where you are, but I mean, how would you summarise that kind of this argument that's going on at the moment regarding farms?
I think it's the whole farming tax or inheritance tax changes to inheritance tax for farming is not effective. Is fundamentally the problem with it is you will hit the people who have small generational farms that pass on those small generational farms, and I think the problem is that the generational farms are very different from any other sort of corporation or organisation that you might have, in that they are family owned, privately run, people keep hold of the assets and then they pass them on to the next generation. Labour are looking at these as more businesses to be taxed as they're passed on to people, so that they see a fair share of the money that is passed on between generations, as Labour usually do, wanting to get take a slice of that generational wealth and put it into the Treasury. And I think that makes sense in some respects, but unfortunately it's going to be in a position where those who can afford to get away with not having to pay that tax because they figure out the loopholes when it comes to their own farms.
So you talk about the James Dysons of this world, huge landowners.
The Jeremy Clarksons.
Yeah. Well, they're both.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. They're going to figure out a way to get around it. Those who can't, the small run family farms that say own, I don't know, £2 to £3 million worth of farmland, which is a lot of money, but in terms of a farm is probably relatively small, are going to be the ones that are hit. And therefore, when they pass their farm on to the next generation of their family, they're going to have to sell part of that land to be able to pay that inheritance tax back.
And it's part of it the fact that farms are often asset rich but cash poor. So if you suddenly said to a farming family, actually you've got to find 20% of a £3 million asset, how many of them actually have those sorts of liquid assets? Because they can't sell their tractors or their barns or whatever else. So how are they supposed to find that money? And I suppose that's... John, do you have any views on this? Feel free to disagree.
I do disagree in a sense. Well, I don't totally disagree. I personally think that, and I don't think it's a party policy, this particularly, but I do
Go
think...
for it, John. It's okay, don't worry. You're free.
I do think that fundamentally you have to break up the wealth in this country. There is too much inherited wealth. Institutionally, the Oxford colleges, the great landowners have had it since the 12th century. There's no reason for that, and I think that's partly where Labour is obviously coming from. It's obviously one of the few things that will probably go to their base and be popular with their base. Do you think the same with no, hold on.
Yeah, okay.
Let me finish my argument for a minute. And I think that's part of it. Also, I think they're looking at the tax loophole element of this. I just think you have to also think what's the best way of dealing with it, because otherwise you are in the danger, and this is a bit of a weird reference, but it's a bit like Stalin and the smallholders in Russian farming in the 30s, in that on a principle, we want collective farming, we don't believe in all this private enterprise. They actually knackered farming and led to starvation across Russia. And I think, there's a huge danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that's I haven't got a particular solution to that, but I think you have to think of what the solution to that is before you introduce the policy, and I don't think they have.
Yeah, I think first to say that John's absolutely right. So wealth inequality is a huge issue in Britain, and it's a huge issue across the developed world, and actually even more so in other places. And there are a couple of ways to redistribute wealth in any substantial or sensible way. Wealth taxes, progressive taxation like inheritance tax, or war. And that has through history been a very good way of redistributing wealth. War is definitely the worst of those three options.
Let me down with a feather.
Not sure Jeremy Clarkson would agree.
And so that should lead governments to decide that progressive taxation is a really good idea, not least to avoid war. That said, there's a really important thing about taxation, which is that there are a number of reasons why you do it, to raise money, of course, but also to convince people to do things and to shape the country in the way you want. And I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is what kind of Britain do we want? What kind of farms do we want? Is food security important to us? I think food security should be important to us. We have a lot of people to feed, and we've seen recently with things like COVID that some other countries, like China, for example, have decided to become quite protectionist around some of the things. So outsourcing in a globalised way food production, I think is a bad idea.
Or grain from Ukraine.
Or grain from Ukraine. So there are problems caused by these things, particularly in an unstable world. So do you want family farms? Yes. And I think the downside here, I think they also probably generally have higher ethical standards for animals as well. I think what happens here is by breaking up those family farms through this quite low threshold, I know £1 million is a lot of money, but really what does that buy you in terms of land to have a farm on? Realistically, in most parts of the country, not very much. What you do is you change the way farming works in this country. You get rid of those kinds of farms, and instead what you have is large mega farms that do a very different thing. They don't care about biodiversity, they don't care so much about animal welfare, and those people will easily get around it because you just make it into a proper company and offshore it, and you don't make any profit, and then you don't pay any tax. So I think that the reality of the situation is, yes, inheritance tax is a good tax fundamentally. I believe that, but in this situation, it's going to misshape our country. It's going to do the wrong things to local farming, and I think we will all be poorer for that, not just farmers.
It's a bit like the winter fuel allowance again, where you just think Labour have tried to do something which you could think that could work, but have they actually just messed up the actual implementation of it? But we will see. But the other thing that's come up quite a bit is whether it's regarding Trump or the budget, is how Lib Dems are mentioning Europe quite a bit more. And I think that has been an interesting... We're not going to get into that now, but it is interesting that how Ed Davey has mentioned it on both occasions. His first response to it has mentioned about a better relationship with Europe, whether it's to get growth in the economy or to counteract whatever consequences comes from Trump. So it is interesting where that will lead us, and maybe this is a little bit of a foreshadow of what might happen in 2029, but we will wait and see, and there's a lot of water to go under that particular bridge. Final thing we're going to talk on incredibly briefly, just for a couple of minutes, is Kemi Badenoch winning, which is...
Do we need to talk about her for more than a couple of minutes?
No, there's not really a lot to say. Obviously, we've got her shadow cabinet, which unbelievably has Mark Francois in it.
Tell me about that.
I mean, part of it is there's so little talent in that Tory MP.
So a few MPs to choose from.
And some of the big hitters, like Jeremy Hunt, didn't want to be in the shadow cabinet. There's quite a lot of people who did have experience have stepped back. Obviously, the big secretaries of state, you've got Mel Stride coming as Shadow Chancellor. You've got Priti Patel as Foreign Secretary, which is incredible given what happened previously. She was allowed to freelance while she was on the job. And Home Secretary is Chris Philp, who is...
Who?
Well, quite. I'm thinking
I think when you see his face, you'll recognise him. Yeah. He's got a bit of a, I want to say slimy personality is where I would probably go. But we'll see how they do. But, I mean... The only thing we had Prime Minister's questions yesterday as we're recording this. I think only me and Ed we've watched it. First impressions, it was a little bit painful listening to Kemi actually.
So I didn't find it painful at all. I found it joyful. I think
cringeworthy.
For all the harm that Labour have done themselves with their budget in their first 100 days, I think Kemi Badenoch might make up for all of it.
Yeah.
So I said earlier, bar major gaffes, I can't remember a worse performance. I know you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, but I can't remember a worse performance at Prime Minister's Question Times. I thought she chose really weird things to talk about. I don't think she talked well or clearly.
And choosing Donald Trump as a wedge issue was kind of strange, you know. Are you going to apologise for all the nasty things you said about Trump? Which was kind of, and obviously Labour are in a little bit of an awkward position here, but it was a very odd thing to go for.
Considering the majority of British people do not like Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
They're in an awkward position with the US government, but they're not in an awkward position with the electorate here. Are not. What is 28% of people here would consider voting for Donald Trump? Yeah. Is the current polling? It's higher than
11% of Lib Dems. We are the lowest, but it is still saying 11% of Lib Dems are happy Trump won.
But look, you're not turning over a new stone, are you? That people in the centre, the left, to be honest, the centre-right, and most of the right don't want Donald Trump in this country. Yeah. You're not turning over a new stone. It was very peculiar. So I think that I don't want to sound too smug or excited, because I've been around long enough to know that, you know, sometimes these things turn, that the Conservatives are a powerful electoral force, they're a very successful party, But for me, she's an incredible and unique mix of angry and weak that I just can't see how that is going to come across. And the other two things, I thought Keir Starmer, who is not an adept performer at Prime Minister's Question Times, looked absolutely brilliant against. She made him look great. She made him look strong, confident, all sorts of things. The other thing she did was make him look like he isn't the most London person in the room. Okay. I don't know her background, but if she's not privately school educated and having lived in London since she was 20, then I would be extraordinarily surprised. And maybe these things are unfair to say, but these things matter. These are the impressions, and my impression and my expectation is that it will take some real work to make her brand something that British people will warm to. The other thing I'd say is, I think Reform should also be extremely happy about their selection of Kemi Badenoch as leader. That said, from the final two, she was very clearly the best option.
It shows the weakness, but any last words from you two about Kemi Badenoch before we call this episode to an end?
There's almost, just to tie into what we were talking about at the beginning with Donald Trump, there's almost a temptation to be a little bit worried that the Conservatives are going to see Donald Trump as a success, lurch more towards the right, try and ape what he is aping to try and get the success that he's had in the US and bring it over to the UK. I think it's fairly certain that we don't necessarily have to worry about that, or if they do try to do that, we don't have to worry about it being a success.
I don't agree. I don't agree there. I think we should worry about the harm that causes and about the problem that happens when we start to normalise the kind of rhetoric that Donald Trump, Kemi Badenoch in the past, Nigel Farage often use. But I agree, you can't do, and this, I might look really stupid if she wins an enormous majority, right? but you can't do Trump-style politics with Kemi Badenoch.
No, exactly.
She's not that good at operating.
She's not. Yeah, she's just not good enough.
I agree. And any sort of that sort of Trumpian politics in UK politics is never going to be a good thing, even if you try to do it. What I'm saying is that Kemi Badenoch's not going to be competent enough to be able to do it. She's not the kind of politician that can pull that sort of thing off. And I'll be honest, I'd be surprised. I'd eat my own hands if she even made it to the next general election.
That's what I was thinking. Is if she doesn't start, we've talked about how Labour are losing elections, and some of it is the Tories. They will do better electorally just because they're so low.
Yeah.
But there might be a point in this Parliament where the Tories think she's not doing well enough.
But it might be existential for the Tories because now there's options. The Tories, they are the most politically successful Western party in the world ever. Is the Tories, and they have a fantastic ability to be a chameleon-like party and change to fit their suits. Everyone talks about philosophy and principles in politics. The primary philosophy of the Tory party is gaining power. That beyond everything else, there being expertise at it. And do I think Kemi will get there? I'm a bit like you. I can imagine a couple of bumpy local election results, no massive climb in favourability, Reform doing well, all of which will put pressure. And I can imagine standing down someone like Cleverly or Jeremy Hunt or someone.
Return of Boris.
Oh, well,
that's not impossible.
Yeah,
it really isn't.
There's a lot of by-elections to happen and things like that, and a lot of seats that could happen. So we will see. But but thank you to everyone for watching and listening to this podcast. Thank you for the guys for being with. Well done on your first appearance. We might have them back. Well, let us know in the comments. Who would you like to see back? Would you like to see John Bridges' Ramsay MacDonald anecdotes for another few episodes?
Two references to the 30s.
That's right. No, but it's been. Thank you very much, guys. It is an extraordinary time in history. Whatever happens, things that we can do, we can be the master of our own fate here within the Lib Dems, and it is about campaigning, it is about winning seats. And if you're scared about populism, listening to a podcast is great, but going out and winning and campaigning and fighting is what you need to do. So really appreciate you listening and watching. We'll be back with loads more episodes coming up, and we will see you next time.